Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or thank you if you are new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and I guess all of the goings on in the reality world now, since reality TV seems to have a fascination with cults and the people in cults and all the wild behaviors we've started to see from people within cults. And Taylor Frankie Paul, the now ex-Mormon, is no exception. Now, I went live and for some reason my stream just stopped, but on my end it said it was still recording. So I was continuing to talk to nobody for 45 more minutes. So I was like, okay, that's not a good look. So once this video is up, I'm going to just go ahead and take down the last video from yesterday, but this will just be everything we know so far. I have my notes in front of me here, so I can just kind of give you guys the lowdown. This live probably won't be that long, and also I'm not as slimy. I'm still pretty shiny because I'm still hyper moisturized because the pollen in my area is just making my face absolutely burn the second I walk outside. So she's shiny, but she doesn't look like a total slug like yesterday. So even looking at some of the playback, I was like, I don't want to look at myself. It's if you had because I suffered from really bad acne growing up. So if you ever had craterous acne that was painful that you were covering up, maybe other people don't notice it, but you can feel it on your face. So it's all you can think about when you're in public. That's how I feel right now. And especially yesterday with all of the aquifer I had slathered all over my body. Hey, Jessie, good to see you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in. And just because there have been some new details and a little bit of confusion about what violent incidences have been being discussed, I'm just going to go through kind of a chronological timeline of events. This is basically everything we learned from yesterday's hearing. So just to preface, because I went into the hearing thinking it was going to be different, this was basically a preliminary custody hearing that is leading up to the actual hearing regarding the TRO and a new custody agreement that is happening at the end of the month. So this is just determining parental visitation for the next about 3.5 weeks based off of the temporary restraining order that Dakota filed for. So that hearing on the 30th will establish the long-term agreement, but this was just to try to figure out, okay, what's the visitation going to look like with this new, TRO and Dakota and Taylor's relationship. So here we go. So in, late 2022, 2023, these two got involved in their relationship. So they were not together very long before that 2023 incident occurred. I believe it was March 2023, which is the event that video that got leaked is from, where we see Taylor throw chairs at Dakota and where one of those, well, not chairs, metal stools, and one of them ended up hitting her daughter, which is really, really obviously heartbreaking and disturbing. So there was someone who was introduced as the guardian ad litem in this hearing, and they provided a summary of the probable cause statement that kind of came from the incident, where the mother allegedly, well, not allegedly, we saw it in the video, threw metal chairs during an argument where that chair struck the child. Now, criminal charges were charged from that incident, and the case later resulted in a plea which would reduce the charge if Taylor had successfully completed her probation, which basically lined out that she could not drink and she could not get in trouble with the law until August 2026. Otherwise, it would essentially become a federal offense. So she was not successful with that. Now, according to this individual, Taylor completed domestic violence treatments, also parenting classes, and other required steps due to her plea, but that plea period had not fully expired at the time of this particular hearing. So, this is kind of the timeline we have now. 2022, the couple meets. 2023 is that explosive fight where the video came from. And then a year later, 2024, their child Ever is born. So even though there were criminal charges against Taylor, these two people continued to be interwoven into each other's lives. Now, we heard through the grapevine, kind of, or there were whisperings on social media that there was a second incident. Now, a lot of people are getting this piece confused. 2023 was the first incident with the stool. Then we had the most recent incident in February 2026, just last month, or I guess 2 months ago. And we finally heard that in May of 2025, there was another violent incident. And this is where things start to get really, really murky in this preliminary hearing, because allegedly there's another video that no one has seen besides the people investigating this that showed Taylor pushing and shoving Dakota while he was holding their child. Now, Taylor's side argues that this happened in her home after she repeatedly told Dakota to leave, but he refused and essentially used his child Ever as a, human shield between the two of them. So this brings about the argument, was this reactive abuse? Did Dakota recognize that if he, poked and poked and poked at the bear, which it would be Taylor in this instance, would she do something explosive and violent to him again while in the past? And did he intentionally, or like she did in the past, and would he intentionally be putting their child in between the two of them because he knew about, obviously he knew about her probation. Obviously he has this, video that he can hold over her head. And he probably knows that if she violates the probation and gets another violent incident on her record, her probation would be totally, null and void. She would be served those charges from back in 2023. So additionally, the next month, Dakota would file yet another custody action because we learned in this preliminary hearing that there hadn't been any real adjustments to the custody agreement. Actually, we discovered that Dakota kind of gave most of the custody willingly to Taylor. And later in the preliminary hearing, we kind of hear that one of the arguments from Taylor's side is that she has a much larger support network in Utah. Dakota's from Idaho, and I believe most of his family is out of town. So maybe he didn't feel like he could provide the best care to their child without that support. So a 50-50 custody wasn't really working for them anymore. And from my understanding of what we watched yesterday, Taylor had, not sole custody. They still divided it up, but she was the primary caregiver of the child. Now, Dakota's side, when they talk about this May 2025 incident, they argue that the video that they saw showed a dangerous loss of control while the child was physically present, and this is starting to become a pattern of behavior for on Taylor's part. So Dakota filed a custody action in July, and by August 2025, there were adjustments to the custody agreement. So it maintained that Taylor would have primary custody, but it would be described as a 70-30 split, or 20 out of 28 days ever would be in Taylor's custody. Now, even as to this hearing that we watched yesterday, that agreement had apparently not yet been formally entered because of unresolved paperwork, but both sides had effectively been using that, as their guidelines from August 2025 to February 2026. They just generally followed the custody arrangement, even though it wasn't officially filed. Now, later, the petitioner's side said that the mother had also been away for work for part of that time, August through February, and that the father had actually been acting as the primary caretaker more recently. And that brings us to this kind of shady 2020 or February 22nd, 23rd / 23rd, 24th. These events happened so late at night that there's been kind of confusion as to what dates there actually were, because one incident happened, I believe, the 22nd at like 11 or 12, and then the other one happened at like the 24th, but at like 12:30 in the morning. 24-hour period where a lot of things happened late at night. So we have one violent incident where it appears that Taylor is the aggressor. We have a second incident that's been documented from May 2025 where it again appears that Taylor is the aggressor. However, in both of those incidences, it does look like Dakota is also poking the bear. And that is exactly what each side is arguing. Dakota's representatives are saying, Taylor was the aggressor. Dakota is in an abusive relationship. Dakota is being coerced. Dakota is the victim of a domestic violent assault. And of course, Taylor's side is saying he provokes her. He does things to force himself into her life. He consistently shows up to her house. And one side is saying, well, Dakota was invited openly by Taylor late in the evening. And the other side is saying he basically wouldn't stop harassing Taylor until she invited him over. So there's still very much this like he said, she said situation going on. So now for that most recent incident in February 2026. Now, sorry, I got my notes a little jumbled. So the parties describe two different interactions that happened in that, late 2022 / early 20 or February 22nd to early February 24th. It's confusing. I'm getting confused. So there was one incident. The first incident is being called the truck tussle incident. So in the early morning hours, Dakota went to Taylor's house. Now, Taylor's side said that he came over to talk about the relationship at like 11:30 at night, and she agreed to talk to him in his truck because she didn't want things to escalate inside the home where not just his child was sleeping, but her children from her previous marriage. Taylor alleges that once she was inside that truck, Dakota drove away with her in the truck, essentially against her will, leaving his child and her other two children alone in the house. Alone. Now, if that actually happened, absolutely inappropriate. And it gets worse. Now, according to Taylor, Dakota slammed her head into the dashboard and injured her knee and her elbow, essentially like hit and punched her in the knee and elbow. Now, Taylor did submit photos to show bruising on her forehead and her knee. However, there was confusion from the court that asked, like, okay, well, if this was a violent incident, why wasn't it reported? These photos are coming from Taylor. Like, Taylor took these photos. She essentially took selfies and submitted them as evidence to the court, but they're not potentially not officially considered evidence because they weren't taken by a state official, like a police officer. So I think the court was trying to ask, like, okay, well, if this was really a moment where she felt like she was the victim, why wouldn't she call the police? But we all know in situations like this, it can be really complicated and scary for any victim to want to go to the police. And even if Taylor has been the primary aggressor in this situation, she also has her probation looming over her head. So that would also be another reason why she probably would not want to report this to the police. So whether or not that was a fair assessment or argument for the court, the judge to bring up, that is kind of up to you. I see a new comment here. I just want to see, this one looks really interesting. Candy Kane says, "Hi, I'm a Master's of Social Work student. I'm really curious about the legality behind this reactive abuse claim. Poke the bear or not, she's still engaged in physical abuse." I absolutely agree with that sentiment and that point. She also says if situation was reversed, if Dakota threw the chair, people wouldn't question why he did it. They would just see that he was physically abusive. And I agree with that. Absolutely. Now, I think that two things can be true at once. I think that it can be a tactic for a narcissistic person to try to, poke the bear, so to speak, instigate an argument to prove that the other person is the crazy one and is the wild one. But it is fully in Taylor's responsibility to manage her reactions. She is a mother. Her child is in the room. And I said this in my live yesterday, but I'll say it again here since I will be deleting my slimy, gross live. I want to say that when you get someone to a state of anger and you trigger them so deeply, and then you realize, oh, I know how to trigger them, that is the most easy way to be controlled. Taylor should be aware of her triggers and how she deals with those triggers in a way that is not going to cause herself or other people harm. If she is so quick to anger in this way, and there's a difference between being quick to anger and quick to violence. We are seeing a pattern where Taylor is very, very, very quick to not just anger, but quick to violence. In season 4 of Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, we really start to see how quickly she can become unhinged. And we see her friends, the other women, even her own family members, really walking on eggshells around her. They're afraid to tell her anything. They're afraid to give her information because they know her reaction is going to be explosive. And then when she finds out the information, she gets mad again because they were so afraid to tell her that they didn't tell her soon enough. She is a volatile individual, and there's no excuse for that kind of behavior, especially in front of a child who is impressionable, who is going to be traumatized by this incident, and who can be hurt in the process. If it is true that Dakota was holding their son during the May 2025 incident and she was still trying to physically shove Dakota out of the home or at all, that is still on her. She needs to have the wherewithal to recognize my child is here. I need to walk away and disengage from this situation. I need to call the police if I feel like my life or my child is in danger. I need to call a friend over here to give me support. I need to really try to ground my emotions so that nobody gets hurt or harmed. Awesome. Thank you, Candy. She says she's agreed. So the Masters of Social Work agrees with me. Thank you for validating my take. And, we're seeing this just toxic energy activity happen on both sides. I think Dakota knows exactly what to do to cause harm to Taylor. And I think that Taylor really wants to have control over Dakota, and she does it. Her reactions are so volatile. I don't even think she has the awareness. Despite all of that parenting class and therapy she went to after the first incident, it's showing that there's a pattern of behavior and that Taylor hasn't changed, despite the fact that she should be aware of how she reacts, and she should know all this. She should know how to disengage and get out of this scenario in a safe way for both herself and her children and Dakota, but she has not been doing it since the first incident, and that is very, very troubling. Now, additionally, Taylor's side argued that after the truck incident, she wanted separation, but he lingered outside her home. So effectively what happened is this. According to Taylor, he begs her to come over. She says, you can come over, but you can't come inside. She goes into his truck. He drives her away in the truck and slams her head on the dash. She gets injured. He effectively physically abuses her. Then she begs to go back home. He brings her back home, but he will not leave her home. So he goes onto her patio once she gets inside and is like knocking on the window and then starts texting her. Now, this is where Taylor's lawyer brings up new pieces of evidence, trying to kind of paint Dakota as like more of the aggressor, as not really a victim. So essentially he shares these texts where Dakota is basically begging Taylor for sex after he drops her off at home. So Taylor's, representative, Taylor's lawyer is essentially saying like, okay, if Dakota is so abused, why is he like harassing her, begging her for intercourse after she's asked him to leave? Again, all we know is what we know from from Taylor's side, because Dakota argues that instead of that, that Taylor continued to contact him after that situation, and they even pointed to like over 100 phone calls that Taylor had made to Dakota. So, we have evidence from both sides. The evidence on both sides seems very incriminating, but what we're seeing evidentiary-wise and video-wise is what looks like Taylor completely jumping into a physical altercation. And honestly, like, hindsight is 2020, but I guess like if I don't even know if I want to say that, because I've been lucky enough to not have ever been in a DV situation, so I don't know, you have fight, flight, fawn, freeze. I'm like more of a freeze person. I'm more of like I don't know what to do, so I just like don't do anything. Because I think, what you want to say is like, well, if I was Taylor and I was worried and scared of Dakota and he came over to my house in the middle of the night and pulled me into his truck and drove away, I would pull out my phone and start recording him because he recorded me the other time. But it's like, so did that even happen? Or is that even fair to make that assessment? Because, all of us from the outside could make that argument of, well, if I was in that situation, this is what I would do. But it's like, you just don't know. It just goes to show, like, the evidence is really confusing, but it goes to show the situation is, like, very, very, very nuanced, and two things can be true at once. I said it yesterday. I feel like these two people are not just like oil and water. They're more like gasoline and fire. And when they come together, it is just explosive. So now, there has still been no police report connected to the February 2026 incident. The Draper Police Records request has been denied because the matter was still open. However, the district attorney is reportedly still screening charges against both parents. So this has been run up the chain all the way up to the DA. So A temporary protective order was entered after the February 2026 incident, and it did suspend the mother's contact with the child. And the father, Dakota, then sought to keep restrictions in place and asked for supervised contact. So what's interesting, and I feel like Taylor's lawyer kind of tripped over himself here, but he discussed like how if Dakota was so concerned about the children, why didn't he file for supervised contact? And then the judge was like, well, he filed for no contact, which is more restrictive than supervised contact. So it was kind of like, I feel like he flubbed that situation more. And Taylor later had filed her own protective order against him, creating this possibility of like competing claims at the hearing that will happen on April 30th. Now, there was a DCFS caseworker assigned to this case, and it was reported that domestic violence-related child abuse against the mother and failure to protect the father were kind of occurring simultaneously. So the court did note that these, child services investigations, I suppose, were beginning, but the court also noted that the services were voluntary and weren't directly enforceable like a court order. So where are we now in regard to the next 3 weeks and what the visitation with Ever, Dakota, and Taylor looks like? So the judge discussed the troubling video from the 2023 incident. He discussed what allegedly happened in May 2025 and considered the February 2026 allegations. He recognized the lack of police reports. He recognized recommendations from advocates for child welfare. And the judge initially ordered, which is kind of sad, only 6 hours of supervised parenting for the next 3 weeks. So Taylor would only be able to see her son 6 hours a week, but somebody had to be there to supervise. Now, they were kind of considering there are 4 people that have been approved by both parent to be supervisors, but the judge brought up the concern that, 2 of these individuals are Taylor's family. So their perspective is going to be skewed. They could, say they're there and not be there, or when they do their reports, because I guess if you're supervising a parental visit, you need to file reports or keep track of what's going on during the visit. And there was concern that they would skew the report in Taylor's benefit. But then upon some discussion, it got increased to 8 hours per week with an official assigned person who is not connected to either Dakota or Taylor. So there is an outside perspective as to, observing how Taylor is with the child. So now officially it's going to be 8 hours of supervised visitation per week. But they might still be able to have, friends and family of Dakota and Taylor be involved, but it's kind of up to the court's jurisdiction and depends on the appropriate circumstances. And that is where we are now. So, after all of that back and forth, Taylor gets 8 hours of supervised visitation, preferably a professional in social services to watch her with her child. I mean, that's one day a week. And even if it's broken up into 2 4-hour slots or, 4 2-hour slots, it's just kind of heartbreaking when you really think about it from Taylor's perspective. But from an outsider looking in, appropriate, because, and the judge brought this up, he does not trust that she, her volatileness, she goes from 0 to 100 so quickly and seems to completely lose control. How long until it gets more violent? there's no excuse for violence in an argument, especially in front of a child. And here's something that's like really, really scary to think about, because we've discussed that like it can take like 7 attempts to escape a DV situation. And usually it's the most dangerous as you are trying to leave. There were, and I don't want to say this, I'm sharing this more as an educational statistic instead of like alleging that this happened. However, I have seen online from online users, there was alleged choking at the most recent incident, but that was not brought up in the court hearing, so it could completely be hearsay. However, once an argument between two individuals escalates all the way to strangulation or choking, whether it's with hands or, a shoelace or something seemingly that doesn't seem like as dangerous, the likelihood of those two people, their arguments escalating to a homicide situation increases by, I think the statistic it's got to be between like 50 and 70%. I think what I heard, it was like 7 times more likely, maybe 8 times more likely for one of those people to be killed at the hands of the other. I think that what this situation is kind of, why it's so triggering to so many people is, we're seeing a reality star be held more accountable for what she did than we're seeing, people who's named in the Epstein files, what they've done for them. So people are very, very frustrated at the system in regard to this case. We're also seeing, arguments that Candy had shared here, that like if Dakota had thrown the chair, no, this would not even be an argument. It doesn't matter if, she was poking his bear and he got mad and threw stuff and it hit the child. Like there would be no question about it. So there is that like sexism angle in it. And then you have people who are still supporting Taylor, who want to believe in this reactive abuse. But I just don't think in this scenario, like at some point you have to take responsibility for your actions, right? I mean, even there's this term / tactic called gray rocking, where if you start to recognize that you are living with an abuser or you are in like you're friends with a narcissist, because narcissists, they just want to have control over you and your emotions. And the second they don't have that control anymore, they kind of leave you alone because they can't like play with